Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Lady for Bristol East for bringing this very important debate forward. And I'm very happy that I've been called to speak in it. It is time that we indeed did shine a light on the inequality and suffering that exists within the global supermarket chain, which is, as we've heard today repeatedly, nothing short of slavery. Of course, the real issue is that supermarkets have become hugely powerful, and we've heard that set out so eloquently by the member from South Holland and Deepings, which means that workers and small-scale suppliers and farmers across the globe, but perhaps particularly, but not exclusively, in developing countries, where suppliers and workers are much more vulnerable to discriminatory policies, and they can face great suffering and unfairness due to this power imbalance. But as the Honourable Member for Bristol East, the Honourable Member for Ipswich and the Honourable Member for Gateshead have reminded us, such exploitation is often closer to home as well, and perhaps epitomised in our minds by the Morecambe Bay tragedy of the cockle pickers. We've heard much today, and it was mentioned again by the Member for Edinburgh North and Leith, about Oxfam's very important report, Right for Change, which presents new and alarming evidence of suffering faced by women and men behind the supermarket barcodes. And whilst it is a positive thing that supermarkets help to create jobs in developing countries, this cannot blind us to the outrage of human and labour rights abuses in the supply chains of the foods we eat. And the Honourable Member for Edinburgh North and Leith has reminded us of that in very powerful terms. Oxfam reminds us of forced labour aboard fishing vessels in South East Asia, to poverty wages on Indian tea plantations and hunger faced by workers in South African grape farms, very well set out by the Honourable Member for Bristol East. And what we are seeing is gross global inequality and escalating climate change, which must be increasingly unsustainable. The fact is that in this global market, supermarkets choose their products from all over the world, moving between countries and suppliers as the seasons change, with all sorts of fruits and vegetables being sold at all times of the year. But cheap food and all year round choice comes at a price, and the price is that the big retailers are exerting huge and intense pressure on suppliers to cut costs, while at the same time demanding the highest quality. And the prices paid to suppliers continue to be squeezed, as the Honourable Member for South Holland and Deepings set out, while at the same time there is inadequate support for small-scale farmers and workers from governments in producer countries. And these factors have increased the risk of human labour rights violations. And this manifests itself in such practices that if we could see them for ourselves every day as we bought our produce, would make us, I think, feel very uncomfortable. Practices such as exploitative child labour and unpaid female labour. And as the Honourable Member for Ipswich pointed out, supermarkets must know how their suppliers operate, and if they don't know, then they should know. We all want our grocery bills to be as low as possible, but how many consumers are truly aware of the real cost of cheap groceries? All too often, the cost is that those who produce the food on our supermarket shelves are themselves trapped in poverty and face brutal working conditions, with many themselves going hungry. And sadly, Oxfam has indicated that Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrisons, Asda, Lidl and Aldi are increasingly squeezing the prices they pay suppliers, with less and less of the price we pay at the till reaching the small-scale farmers and workers who actually produce the food we eat. Alarmingly, of the supply chains Oxfam looked at, none enabled people to earn enough for even a basic standard of living. And in some cases, like Indian tea and Kenyan green beans, it was less than half of what they needed to get by, and we were reminded of that by the member for Bristol East. Women face routine discrimination, often providing most of the labour for the lowest wages. More than 9 out of 10 grape workers in South Africa and seafood processors in Thailand, surveyed, most of whom were women, said they had not had enough to eat in the previous month. And several members, like the member for Bristol East and the member for Edinburgh North and Leith, have pointed that out today. And we've heard from many members today how the cheap food we buy in supermarkets comes at the cost of squeezing prices to suppliers, which creates huge suffering for the women and men who supply this food, trapping them in poverty.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I think all the speeches so far today have been excellent. I think people are coming along, but I think if you look at the comparison with the clothes sector, I think we reached a point some years ago where people started questioning that if you could buy a pair of jeans for £3 in a supermarket, something must be wrong. You know, somewhere down the line, somebody is being exploited to be able to produce something that cheaply. Does she agree with me that we need to do the same with our food and start questioning why it is so cheap?
Well, he's absolutely right, and I think that the debate around how we change the culture of the cheap clothing and the cheap food is about making sure our consumers are as well informed as they can be when they go out to do their shopping, whether it's to buy clothes or whether it's to buy groceries. Because I think when the public see the cost behind the cheap price, I think many are moved to perhaps change how they shop or what they buy. So I think you're absolutely right. Among 12 common products, including tea, orange juice and bananas, UK supermarkets receive almost 10 times more of the checkout price than the small-scale farmers and workers who produce them. The UK supermarket share rose from 41% in 1996 to nearly 53% in 2015. As the Honourable Lady from Bristol East pointed out, demonstrated, this represents a race to the bottom in terms of what's paid to suppliers. Oxfam and the Sustainable Seafood Alliance Indonesia examined the working conditions in prawn processing plants and exporters in Thailand and Indonesia, respectively, which supply some of the world's biggest supermarkets, including 6 UK supermarkets. And workers described forced pregnancy tests, unsafe working conditions, poverty wages, strictly controlled bathroom and water breaks, and verbal abuse. Supermarkets, ethically, should lead the way if positive change is to happen in our food supply chains. And that's why Oxfam's new supermarket scorecard, which rates and ranks the most powerful UK supermarkets on the strength of their public policies and practices to address human rights and social sustainability, should be welcomed. These challenging benchmarks, based on robust and international standards and widely recognised best practice on transparency and accountability, and on the treatment of workers, small-scale farmers and women in supply chains, will allow our consumers across the United Kingdom to make more informed choices and help to effect change in supermarket practices and encourage them to address the suffering in their supply chains, because, as we've heard, when consumers have more information, it affects how they purchase and what they buy.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would she agree with me that while it's true that they should ethically do this due diligence, actually having something in legislation which required them to do so would be more powerful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably in the past what works best is both a stick and a carrot approach. The government can lay down regulations and insist by law that certain things are done by supermarkets in the supply chain in this country. But I think also the power of the consumer cannot be underestimated. So I think it's a two-pronged approach, but I think we need both of those approaches. So we need to have firmer regulation to protect the rights of farmers and workers. We have the modern slavery legislation, but it's important that we continue to be committed to challenging all practices that puts people at risk of suffering within our supply chains by convening other nations against modern slavery, as the UK has done at the UN for the last 2 years. Engagement with the ongoing independent review of the Modern Slavery Act, ensuring the promotion of transparency within the global supply chains, and a commitment to the UN guiding principles relating to business and human rights is essential. Supporting the UN binding treaty on business and human rights is required, and I'm very interested to hear what the Minister has to say today. And as the Honourable Lady for Bristol East has reminded us, those who fear a race to the bottom in food standards post-Brexit will only exacerbate all the matters raised today that are of concern. We can do more to mitigate and ease the suffering on a global scale in our supermarket supply chains, and we should do what we can. And we should do what we can as a matter of urgency. And I'm sure today's debate has raised the profile of this issue, and I hope that consumers will begin to exert pressure of their own in the choices that they make. But we need to do more to ensure supermarkets themselves are confronted with the part that they play in this suffering and abuse of workers and small-scale farmers in some of the poorest countries in the world. And that is how real change will come. But the UK government must play its part, and I'm keen to hear the Minister's response as to how she thinks that her government will address the very serious issues raised today.